Whoa, guys, I don't know about you, but I'm having some like flashbacks to last year doing this. Thankfully, it's only temporary. Today's lesson is going to be about the home front of the Civil War, some things you guys probably don't know. Obviously, you don't know it, or you wouldn't need me. So I'm going to get into home front stuff, and I'm also going to talk about leadership problems during the Civil War for the North. And we're going to take a look at something called the Peninsular Campaign that takes place in 1862. This ill-fated attempt to attack Richmond that ends up totally flopping. Okay, so start things out. Let's go to the screen share. Doink, doink. All right. So once again, the lesson is to understand how the Civil War impacted the home fronts in both the North and the South, how a lack of leadership in the North would cause the war to last longer than anticipated. Okay, so let's start off with the kind of obvious home front stressors here. Hold on a minute. Let me see if I can get this thing. That's better. Okay, so inflation. War puts a lot of pressure on economies, right? And both sides are going to attempt to pay for this thing, but as you know, like Southern money isn't worth anything. And it's bad enough that the United States government is actually going to authorize the printing of money. But when Southerners do it, their money's really worthless. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, let's talk inflation. Okay. In order to pay for this war, the United States government is going to print more money. Okay. And inflation in the North is going to be 80%. So think about that. Goods are going to be 80% more expensive as a result of the currency being just injected into the economy in order to pay for this conflict. 80%, like by most standards, 80% it's a stinking lot. Like that's a lot of inflation. In the South, 9,000%. Yep, you heard that right. 9,000% inflation. How can you buy anything? It kind of reminds you, if you think about it, of the Weimar Republic in Germany, right after World War I. And you see like photographs of like German school kids playing with bricks of money like they're Legos or something, right? Well, you can effectively do the same thing with Confederate money. I've had students like bring in like Confederate money, be like, ready, look at this. It's like an artifact. It's like, what is this thing worth? It's like old and stuff. And I'm like, nothing. It's worth nothing. It's Confederate money. It's who cares? Like, it's 9,000% inflation. 9,000. Okay. So obviously the economic stress of this war is really going to hit the South hard. And that makes their an already bad situation worse. Okay. Profiteering. So in the video that I showed you guys last week, Ken Burns' video, he has a line in there on the first day when we were watching it that the war made some rich and ruined others. Okay. There are people that make money off of tragedy. And the word we use for them is profiteers. Okay. And it's nasty business. Like, to be a war profiteer is you're pretty much a scumbag. And people would profiteer in different ways, companies, that just made ammunition and uniforms and stuff like that. They would get these government contracts, especially in the North, to produce stuff for the war. I mean, that's a little bit different because that's what they do for a living. I mean, you are a war profiteer. If you make cannons and rifles and you make uniforms and things like that, that's what you are, right? But there's also other kinds of profiteering, like people that signed up for multiple enlistments, right? Like, so this was a thing. Like, sometimes people would sign up to be in the army, especially in the North, the Union Army, to get their sign up bonus or whatever, and then they would do it again. They would desert and try and do it again under a different name. Okay. And they would do that sort of things. There were also, with war profiteering, there were also bounties. Like, I explain these to you. So people could buy their way out of the conflict. Okay. I believe the price to buy your way out of the Civil War, and this isn't profiteering, this is more like problems with the draft. Okay. And I'll be talking about the draft here in a minute, but I might as well while I'm talking about making money. There were wealthy people that could buy their way out of service in the United States military for about $300. They were referred to as $300 men. Okay. And some of them what would happen was you would pay somebody else to go for you into the military. So you wouldn't have to be drafted. Okay. And what would happen is sometimes these people that you would pay, they would pocket your money and sign up. And then they would desert their unit and pocket somebody else's money and sign up again. You see this? So not only is it bad that you could buy your way out of the war. I mean, what is that, right? So rich men can buy their way out of this thing. But then there are people that even took advantage of that by signing up more than once. What a disaster, correct? And a lot of times, recruitment officers would get bounties, or they would be paid more money if they would sign up more soldiers for the conflict. So oftentimes recruitment officers would lie to young men about what they were signing up for, especially if those young men were, not particularly well educated. And so because the recruitment officers would often make more money, right, for signing up more people. So they would try and deceive you to get more people to sign up. All right. So like, that's not good. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the Civil War. It wasn't as regulated back then. So it was just kind of tough to keep track of this. And this war profiteering, right, making money off of this tragedy went all the way up to Lincoln's cabinet. This was Simon Cameron. You can see here, he's a Secretary of War. And his tenure in office was just filled with allegations of corruption and mismanagement and taking bribes and giving, preferential contracts out to his friends to produce stuff for the war, right? This is a politician making money off this conflict. Simon Cameron, okay? I mean, look at this guy. He just kind of looks like a douchebag, right? Like, look at him. Okay. So, it's a good example of what I'm trying to talk about. The draft. So in the Civil War, it was the first war in United States history where both sides started drafting people against their will, right? The meat grinder that is war. And for the reasons that I explained in my tech video, I mean, you just lose men like crazy in this conflict. I mean, nobody on either side is ready for the kind of carnage that the Civil War is going to produce. I mean, thousands and thousands of casualties in every battle. It's like, just stuff you've never seen before, like you saw earlier with the Battle of Shiloh video that you watched in class, that like, in one battle, it was more than every American war previous to this combined in one battle. Okay. And like, so you're going through manpower like crazy. And after a while, people start reading these casualty numbers, in the newspapers and whatnot. And they're like, I don't want to go to that. Like, I'm not signing up for that. Like to go marching into these like bullets that are now more accurate than they've ever been. And like the horrendous injuries and the amputations and guys bleeding out and gut shot and all that kind of stuff. They're like, I don't want to head into that. And so they, both sides start finding it more difficult to sign people up. All right. And so now you got to draft. Now you got to institute a draft that is going to bring people in against their will. Right. And like I said, rich people can buy their way out of it. The phenomenon for that, and this is a phrase we're going to be using later in this class for other wars, so that's why I'm putting it up here. The phenomenon is known as rich man's war, poor man's fight. Okay. And, you know, $300 can buy you out. Right. And people have been draft dodging. That means from the beginning. Okay. It's not like Donald Trump was the first draft dodger in United States history. He just, you know, was still able to become president despite it. People were dodging the draft back then. Okay. Rich man's war, poor man's fight. The Civil War is absolutely like exactly that. Okay. And you know, if you remember what I told you about Southern soldiers, you know, most of the guys filling the ranks of the Confederate Army are never going to own slaves, right? These are generally poorer people that are fighting in the armies of people like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, who are people who had more money, okay? So you got these guys that are wealthier whose ranks are filled with these poor guys that you've duped into fighting this conflict, right? They're never going to own slaves. We had this conversation. The draft riots, though, in New York are very indicative of all this. So the New York City draft riots in 1863, largely led by German and Irish immigrants, okay? And they especially targeted Black men. You know, this goes back to what I taught you guys about Irish immigration. The only people in society at this time that Irish immigrants were like ahead of, if you will, were Black Americans. And they competed with Black people for jobs. And when the war becomes about slavery in 1862, rather than just secession, it becomes a war also against slavery. A lot of the Irish immigrants are like, wait a minute, I don't want to be drafted in a war so that I could free the people who are then going to take my job in the cities, okay? Because they're no longer going to be slaves. And so they revolted. And this riot in the streets of New York were really, really, really bad. You know, people were killed. Lincoln had to divert some of his troops to New York City in order to put this down. You know, I mentioned this, I think, a couple of weeks back when we were on the subject of Irish immigration, but, you know, these guys are going to, you know, do impromptu lynchings of any Black person they come across in the streets. There is an orphanage for Black children that gets destroyed in all of this looting and rioting. I mean, it gets really bad. The streets have to be cleared by force and by gunfire, okay? So with all the problems going on with this conflict, the draft riots is just one more thing, you know, standing in the way of victory, especially for the Union. So another stressor on the home front for the Union is what is known as the Dakota Uprising of 1862. And this was a Native American uprising where a group of Native Americans in what is now the Minnesota Territory. Okay, so Minnesota was still a little bit loosely organized at the time. And this group known as the Dakota Sioux had a contract with the United States government wherein the U.S. promised to respect Native American land in the Minnesota Territory as white settlers moved in there in exchange for not getting attacked. And part of this deal was Native Americans would allow white settlers into the region, right, to farm and whatnot. And in exchange would receive food and blankets and things like that from the United States government. Okay, that was supposed to be the deal. But what happened is that many of these white settlers acted irresponsibly when they moved into Minnesota Territory. Surprise, surprise. They overfished the lakes and the streams. They cut down too many trees. They put the wildlife, therefore, that the Native Americans lived off of at risk. And then in addition to all of this, when the Civil War breaks out, people that were involved in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, like the United States government, whose job it was to deal and make treaties and stuff with the Native Americans, they could get away with a lot of shady stuff, okay? And because all eyes are on the Civil War. Nobody's paying attention to the Native Americans up in Minnesota, okay? And eventually, what starts to happen is the United States agents that are supposed to be providing food and supplies and stuff to Native Americans start slacking off, and they start providing like food that is spoiled, right? The Native Americans are supposed to pay a certain amount for it, but at a discount. And some of these agents are demanding more than they're supposed to get for this food from the Native Americans and start giving them poor quality stuff or nothing at all. And eventually what starts to happen is some of these Dakota, they start to starve. They start to get into a very desperate situation because we aren't holding up our side of the bargain. We, meaning the United States government. And therefore, some of these Dakotas start raiding white settlements along the border, okay, in the Minnesota territory. And that results in, of course, a lot of white settlers crying foul, like, oh, they're breaking their side of the deal. They're attacking our settlements and they're killing our families and whatnot, right? And so they go crying to the United States government. And now Lincoln's like, what, so a detachment of troops is sent out there to handle this, what becomes known as Dakota Uprising of 1862. And after many of them are defeated in combat and the leaders of the uprising are rounded up, they're going to be executed. Like the uprising is put down, right? These are Native Americans who are starving and are having their land taken from them, and the animals they hunt taken from them, the fish that they fish for taken from them, right? But they're being hanged for it, right? Like this is standard when it comes to U.S. government relations with Native Americans. It's a sad and pathetic relationship on our part, okay? And what ends up happening is we round up suspected leaders of the Dakota Uprising, and all these names are presented to Abraham Lincoln, we want permission to hang these people. Now, Abraham Lincoln, again, his attention is on the Civil War. And when this is put on his desk, he's like, wait a minute, this doesn't look right. I mean, there were like hundreds of names. And so he personally, and this is to Lincoln's credit, whatever you think about him with this, in this situation, to his credit, he actually personally reviewed the cases of some of these guys to make sure that they weren't just on this list for being, an Indian, okay? And granted, were there people on this list that did not deserve to be hanged? Absolutely. I mean, I personally don't think any of them deserve to be hanged. They were just defending their lands and such. But basically, the list gets pared down to 38. And 38 Dakota are marched out. And here's a photograph of it and hanged. It is, to this day in 2021, it is still the largest mass execution of people in United States history. And it's these 38 were all hanged at the same time. Just kind of one of those sad and disgusting chapters about what this nation did to the Native Americans. And there's more of this to come, because when the Civil War ends, right, the focus of this war, now that the Civil War will be over when it ends, the focus will be moving west. And even more so than we were already doing, and invading even more Native American land and forcing them on what will be known as reservations, etc. So that's a tale for later. But just so you know the theme of this, right? The theme of this. And so there's the Dakota Uprising. On a little more of a positive note, in 1863, you see the beginning of the recruitment of Black soldiers, okay? And I kind of told you guys about this before, right? This is partially the brainchild of Frederick Douglass, okay? Some abolitionists, abolitionists have been calling for this war to be against slavery right from the beginning. And same with, guys like Frederick Douglass, especially, Black abolitionists, like allow the people that are being enslaved to fight for their own freedom, okay? And therefore, he was instrumental in getting the first unit created, and this was known as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, okay? For those of you that may have seen this movie, there was a movie that came out in the 1990s that's actually stood the test of time very well. I think I watched it this past summer again. It came out in 1991, I want to say. It was called Glory, and it's the story of these guys. Now, the movie Glory embellishes, and it's not 100% true to what actually happened, although it's very good. These guys were selected on purpose to be successful. Like a lot of the 54th Massachusetts were religious men. A lot of them were free men from the North. There were free men that were volunteering. Frederick Douglass's own son was served in the Massachusetts 54th. And you know, these guys face racism. They faced racism in the North that was almost as bad as the South. You know, when these guys were recruited and everything, you know, white commanders didn't want to use them in combat, didn't trust them. You know, they could only be, the condition that they were even allowed to form was that there would be a white colonel in charge of them. And in this case, it was an abolitionist son by the name of Robert Gould Shaw, who was the one who was the commanding officer. He will not survive the war. But these guys faced less pay, worse conditions in training. They weren't even given uniforms right out the gate. They weren't given weapons right out the gate. They're like, they had to fight literally for everything just to be equipped properly in the military. Okay. Because there's plenty of racism in the North. This is not like, you know, well, you're in the North now, so you're good, son. Like, no. All right. This was rough going. But these guys are going to prove their quality, and it's really an amazing story. One of the things that they're known for is their famous charge on Fort Wagner in 1863. Fort Wagner on the coast in South Carolina there was a fort that was attacked several times. It wasn't taken. And these guys were involved in one of those assaults on Fort Wagner with the goal of trying to what they call reduce the fort so that the Union Navy could get, you know, further up. And these guys led a direct frontal assault across a narrow sandy beach area against Confederate guns. And it was very, very valiant assault. Many of them died in it. It's well documented. You know, people were watching them make this assault. Robert Gould Shaw, the commander of the unit, died in this attack. But what's interesting about it is it's also the reason for the first Black man to conduct an action in battle that would later receive the Medal of Honor. William Carney will be involved in this attack. And after reaching the parapets in the fort that the Southerners are defending, like he actually reaches the wall, right, before he and some of his fellow members of the unit are forced back with horrendous casualties. But he saved the U.S. flag. Like, this was a big deal in the Civil War. You do not leave your flag or regimental colors behind for the enemy to take captive. You don't do that. So when the flag was like dropped, this guy, while wounded, carried the American flag, like crawled in some ways back to U.S. lines and brought the flag to safety. Okay, just an absolutely amazing act of heroism under fire. And he becomes the first Black man to conduct an action of this that would be celebrated with the highest medal that you can achieve in the military, which is the Medal of Honor, okay, for valor in combat. So changes are coming. They're slow, they're imperfect, right? Black Americans fight valiantly in the Northern ranks to try and like end this scourge of slavery, right? You got people being like awarded for like a Medal of Honor for it. Like Abraham Lincoln credited these Black soldiers as helping turn the tide of war, and he's not wrong. I mean, think about it. The North already outnumbers the South by a great deal. Now when they start allowing Black soldiers, that just adds more to that manpower advantage, right? Because Southerners aren't willing to do this. Southerners are not willing to do this till the very end. At the very, very end, they're going to be willing to arm, their enslaved people with who knows what kind of promises, but it'll be too late. I want to spend the rest of this lesson to briefly talk about the Peninsular Campaign of 1862. So, this was a utter and complete disaster. Like, Lincoln's got problems with his commanders, right? Let me just show you what I mean. Here are some of the commanders that Lincoln's going to go through as he tries to find people that can actually prosecute this war to its conclusion correctly. All right, I got a list of them here on my phone. I just want to make sure you. All right, so McDowell is the one who loses at Bull Run, the first battle, Manassas. He gets his butt kicked there, right? And he is going to later on be replaced by a guy named George McClellan, who I'm going to tell you about right now, who's going to be replaced by Ambrose Burnside, right? Who's going to be replaced by Joseph Hooker, who's going to be replaced by George Meade, who is finally going to be replaced by Ulysses S. Grant. Now, that's laughable. You're going to go through all these generals of the Army of the Potomac, which is the main body of the Union Army that is tasked with capturing Richmond. And you can't find anybody to do this job until you get to Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant's a stud. Ulysses Grant's a fighter, right? Ulysses Grant's going to get the job done. But look at all the guys you got to go through before you get to him. None of whom is really successful. And I'm going to start with McClellan, okay? Because McDowell gets fired after Bull Run. And Lincoln tasks McClellan, get Richmond. And McClellan doesn't want to move. He doesn't want to move out of Washington, D.C. George McClellan is routinely viewed as the worst military leader in United States history, okay? Lincoln's like, get on the move, get to Richmond. McClellan comes up with excuses. He doesn't want to fight. His army's not ready yet. Like, he's really good at preparing guys for war. Polish your boots, make yourself look good, march correctly, like learn how to handle your weapons. Everybody liked him for that. But when it's time to actually use the military, didn't want to do it. Didn't want to do it. McClellan, for two reasons, does not want to commit his troops to battle. Reason number one, he doesn't want to be responsible for casualties, right? And that's the paradox of being in the military, grasshoppers. You have to love the army, but in order to be a good commander, you also have to be willing to order the death of the thing you love, okay? And McClellan's just not willing to do that. The other thing is he has sympathy with Southerners. He feels like if we can just beat them just enough to teach them a lesson, they're going to drop this Confederacy thing and come back into the U.S. And that's just not going to happen. And so when Lincoln finally says, look, man, like his famous line about McClellan was, if George McClellan is not going to use the army, perhaps I may borrow it for a little while. McClellan and Lincoln hated each other. George McClellan's going to later run against Abraham Lincoln in 1864 for the presidency. They hated each other, but McClellan doesn't want to lose his job, so he's all right. So you got to picture this direction is north, okay? So instead of using his numerical advantage, the advantage that McClellan has, and just march south like this, spread out your troops and attack and conquer Richmond coming in from this direction from the north, okay, where you can use all the space you want to use your numerical advantage and technological advantage, by the way. He and his commanders come up with this ridiculous idea to send the Union Army by boat along the coastline, okay? Now, the Southerners know they're going to do this because they've got spies and they're not stupid. And Robert E. Lee, who's defending Richmond, knows that George McClellan is pathetic and he's slow, right? And what happens is these Union troops disembark here on the James Peninsula, all right? And they're going to work their way up like this, right? Fighting at Yorktown, which is the same place where the British surrendered to us in the American Revolution. It's really interesting. If you ever go to that battlefield, you can see gravestones from both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, okay? But look at what the Union has done to its forces by attacking a peninsula. Rather than spreading out and attacking, what have they done now? George McClellan has taken his numerical advantage and completely negated it. He's taken this many guys and turned them into this. And he's now marching them up the peninsula like that. And it's absurd. All the Southerners, all they got to do is put up some strong points to delay the Union Army, which they do here and here. And then while Southerners are holding up the advance there, it allows Lee's other generals to just dig in and form a protective ring around Richmond. Okay. One of my favorite stories showing you the commander advantage that Southerners have at the beginning of this conflict involves this guy named Magruder down here. So Magruder was a thespian. He had done a lot of work in the theater. Okay. And knowing he was hopelessly outnumbered, and it was ridiculous. He had a couple thousand guys versus McClellan's 100,000 guys. I mean, you think about having between 70 and 100,000 guys all trapped on this peninsula here. Okay. What Magruder did is, in order to stall the Union advance, the Northern advance, he took his men and he marched them between buildings or copses of trees. He took the same guys and marched them in a loop like this. So it looked like one long line of guys marching. Okay. And he took hollowed out logs and had them painted black and put them out there in front of his positions. They're known as Quaker guns because they're not real guns, right? Think about what you know about the Quakers and their pacifism. Quaker guns are fake guns. And so what happens? McClellan, he's so cautious. He always thinks he's outnumbered. He's a terrible commander anyway. And he looks through his field glasses and he looks at Magruder's lines here and he's like, we're going to need more men, right? Bring up the big guns. We got to wait. Bring up more reinforcements. He's already got Magruder outnumbered 1,000,000-1, but he brings up more guys. Stall, stall, stall. Meanwhile, when McClellan finally decides to attack this position, Magruder's guys have already retreated. McClellan's guys get there, realize that they've been duped, right? But it's too late. By the time they start pushing up the peninsula, the Southerners are ready to fight. And McClellan's forces bottled up. They're going to be easily attacked. They're going to break themselves against the Southern lines. You can see the Southerners are going to retreat back to ground of their choosing. Remember their strategy, right? It's going to force the Union Army to attack across streams and rivers, and they're bottled up, and it's a total disaster. McClellan's going to attack those positions. He's going to get his butt kicked. And over what is known as the 7 days battles, the Union Army is going to retreat back across the peninsula that they had spent so many lives and so much time working their way up. And to add insult to injury, the Confederate cavalry, led by this guy named Jeb Stuart, are going to ride the entirety around the Union Army, mocking them the whole time. The Confederate cavalry is going to just ride around the Union Army. What are you going to do about it? There's nothing you can do about it because you guys suck, right? That kind of a thing. And it's just a really, really ignominious defeat, really embarrassing. The Union Army is going to have to get back on boats and sail back to Washington, D.C., with their tails between their legs, just totally whipped, totally embarrassed, right? I talked about the commander problems of Lincoln, and this failure by George McClellan to take Richmond using the stupid peninsula idea in 1862 is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Best part about this story is George McClellan, look at him here, right? George McClellan is going to be fired after this. You're fired. You stink. What are you doing? But there's nobody to take his place. Lincoln's looking around who do I choose? I mean, there are people to take his place. Their names are Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, two of my favorite people in history, right? Because they're the ones that actually bring this war to an end eventually. But those two guys are way out west in Tennessee, fighting the Battle of Shiloh, which you guys already like learned about. Okay. Those guys are great. And if you remember the Battle of Shiloh, they actually win. They actually force the Confederates off that battlefield at Shiloh, but that's way out in Tennessee, grasshoppers. Nobody cares about Tennessee. Everybody cares about Virginia, because Virginia is where Richmond is located. And so all the eyes are on the Army of the Potomac, and the leader of the Army of the Potomac is this guy, and he gets his butt kicked. And so when it comes time to replace him with nobody to step up, because Lincoln's not really aware of the quality of Grant and Sherman out west, he's got no choice but to hire George McClellan all over again, with the intention of sending him out against Lee again and giving him another chance. And that another chance will take place in Maryland in a battle that will be known as Antietam. And that and the Battle of Antietam is going to be very, very important going forward. And I think you guys will see at the Battle of Antietam, once again, George McClellan will show that he is just not up to the challenge. He's a pathetic commander. And that's a story you're going to find out later. So in the next lesson. So thanks, guys. And I'll see you when I see you.